At 1412 on October 3, 1944, a gray Army transport bus rolled through the main gate of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The gate was double-strung with barbed wire. The towers were manned. The guards carried M1 Garand rifles, 9.5 pounds of walnut and steel, chambered in .30-06, 8 rounds per clip. The bus slowed to a walking pace, tires crunching over gravel. Inside the bus, the prisoners sat rigid. Most did not look out the windows. One of them was 23 years old, a Japanese Army corporal captured in the Marianas months earlier. He had been stripped of his unit, his rifle, and his name, reduced to a number on a tag and a file folder. He had been told since recruit training that surrender was not a state. It was a stain. In the Japanese Army's field code and unit culture, death was preferred. Capture meant disgrace. Capture also meant what he believed was the next step, punishment. He expected the Americans to do what his own side had done to prisoners. He expected fists, rifle butts, boots. He expected torture. He expected execution. In later U.S. interrogation summaries, large majorities of captured Japanese soldiers admitted they anticipated exactly that, torture and death, because it was what propaganda promised and what rumors confirmed. At 1413, the bus stopped in front of the receiving building. An MP corporal stepped up onto the first stair. He was 19, clean-shaven, with a helmet strapped tight under his jaw. He carried a clipboard, a pencil, and a sidearm, an M1911A 1.45 pistol in a worn flap holster. His job was not to fight battles. His job was to prevent fights. He shouted instructions in English. A translator echoed them in Japanese. Single file. Hands visible. No talking. The Japanese corporal swallowed and stood. The bus door hissed. He stepped down into cold air that smelled like pine, diesel, and wet earth. Not the ocean. Not cordite. Not rotting jungle. He looked for the first blow. None came. At 1416, the prisoners were marched across the yard. Boots moved in rhythm. MPs kept spacing, 3 to 5 meters between prisoners, rifles angled down but ready. There was procedure to it. Process mattered. Every movement was a chance to test the perimeter. At 1419, the corporal was searched. At 1421, his possessions were inventoried. What little he had, a small cloth bundle, a photograph creased and faded, a few coins that meant nothing here. At 1425, he was issued camp clothing. At 1428, he was assigned a barracks. No one hit him. No one screamed in his face. No one dragged him behind a building. At 1431, he heard something that didn't fit in the picture he'd carried across the Pacific. A sharp crack. Then another. Not gunfire. Wood on leather. He turned his head. Through the fence line, beyond the administrative buildings, a wide field opened up. A diamond cut into the grass. White chalk lines. A backstop. Men moving in uniforms, shouting in English. The crack came again. Bat meeting ball. The sound carried cleanly through autumn air. The corporal had seen baseball before. Japan had baseball. He had played it as a boy with a stick and a wrapped ball in a schoolyard. Then the war came. Then the army. Then the islands. Now, standing in an American camp, he saw it again. Organized, official, encouraged. The irony landed like a weight. He had prepared himself for beatings. The Americans were playing baseball. At 1433, the MP corporal caught the prisoners' attention drifting and snapped them back into line. He didn't look at the baseball field. To him, it was normal. The camp ran on schedules, work details, chow, roll call, inspections. Recreation was another tool. Idle prisoners were dangerous prisoners. Boredom was a fuel. At 1440, the prisoners reached their barracks. The building was rough lumber, heated, with bunks stacked in rows. There were rules posted in English and Japanese. There was a latrine. There were mess hours. There was medical inspection. There was order. The Japanese corporal sat on the edge of a bunk and tried to understand the shift. In the Pacific, he had seen the opposite of order. He had seen units cut off. He had seen men eat half rations and then none. He had seen officers demand banzai charges against machine guns. He had seen surrender treated as an unforgivable crime. At 14:55, the corporal was called out for initial questioning. This part he expected. Interrogation. Pressure. Tricks. Pain. He was taken to a small office, lit by a single overhead bulb. A table. 2 chairs. Paper. A pot of coffee. The interrogator was not an MP. He wore a U.S. Army uniform but spoke Japanese with a flat American accent. He was part of the Military Intelligence Service, Japanese language specialists trained to extract information. Units, order of battle, supply status, radio procedures, names of commanders, defensive plans. The interrogator did not need to swing a fist. He needed the prisoner to talk. At 15:02, the interrogator began with basics: name, rank, unit, date, and place of capture. The corporal answered cautiously. He watched for the turn. At 15:07, the interrogator slid a cigarette across the table. Not thrown. Offered. At 15:10, he placed a form in front of the prisoner, carefully printed in Japanese, explaining camp rules and basic rights. It referenced the Geneva Convention standards the United States claimed to follow. The corporal didn't fully trust it. He had been trained not to. At 15:14, the interrogator asked a question that sounded almost casual. What did you think would happen when you were captured? The corporal hesitated. In his mind, there was a script. The enemy was savage. The enemy would torture. The enemy would kill. He had seen leaflets dropped on positions claiming humane treatment. His officers had called them lies. Now he was sitting in a chair, unhurt, being offered cigarettes. He answered anyway. He told the truth. He had expected beatings. He had expected torture. He had expected execution. The interrogator wrote it down without reacting. For him, it wasn't surprising. It was consistent. U.S. intelligence teams had been collecting this pattern since early captures in the Pacific. The fear of torture and death wasn't random. It was engineered by doctrine and propaganda, reinforced by what Japanese troops had seen their own side do to prisoners. At 15:23, the interrogator shifted to military specifics. He asked about the prisoner's regiment. He asked about the last known positions. He asked about supply shortages. He asked about mortar calibers and machine gun placements. He asked how often the unit moved at night. The prisoner gave careful answers. Some were true. Some were guarded. At 15:41, the interrogator ended the session without threats. He stood, opened the door, and handed the prisoner back to the MPs. At 15:46, outside again, the prisoner heard the bat crack. The baseball game had continued. The field had not stopped because prisoners had arrived. Life in the camp moved on. The prisoner walked back to the barracks under guard. He did not relax. Not yet. The fear didn't vanish in an hour. It had been built over years. But something had cracked. He had entered the gate expecting brutality. Instead, he had seen procedure, restraint, and, impossibly, baseball. And in that contrast, the Americans were doing something the Japanese army had never trained him to anticipate. They were turning captivity into a weapon of its own. At 18:07 on October 3, 1944, the barracks lights at Camp McCoy dimmed. The Japanese corporal lay on a thin mattress, hands folded on his chest, eyes open. The building creaked in the Wisconsin cold. Outside, the perimeter floodlights washed the fences in hard white. Every few minutes, boots crossed a gravel path and paused, an MP checking locks, counting bodies, verifying routine. At 18:23, someone in the next bunk whispered a name of an island. Guam, Saipan, Tinian. Places the corporal had heard in briefings and then lived through in chaos. The men didn't talk like soldiers planning a fight. They talked like survivors trying to make the last months fit into a story that still made sense. At 19:10, the corporal heard another sound from outside the compound, distant shouting, then laughter. Not taunting. not cruelty. Human noise from people who were not starving, not trapped, not waiting for artillery. He stared at the plank ceiling and replayed the day in exact pieces. The bus. The gate. The search. The cigarette. The bat cracking on leather. He had been trained for a different world. Japanese doctrine in the field didn't just prefer death over capture. It treated surrender as moral collapse. Units carried it like an infection. An officer could order a last charge with rifles empty and expect compliance. Men did it because the alternative, living as a captured soldier, was presented as worse than dying. That belief was enforced with propaganda and with examples. Captured soldiers were described as cowards. Families were told to feel shame. Some men were warned that the enemy would torture them anyway, so there was no point surviving. By 1944, U.S. intelligence knew that belief was a lever. The lever didn't work on every island and every unit. But it worked often enough that the American approach became systematic. Capture whoever could be captured, keep them alive, keep them talking, and use the contrast between expectation and reality as a weapon aimed back across the front line. At 5:42 on October 4th, a whistle blew. Lights snapped on. The prisoners sat up fast, instinctive, military conditioning from years of reveille. Outside, an MP shouted the time. A translator repeated it. At 6:10, breakfast moved through the mess hall in measured lines. Tin trays. Hot liquid that was not tea. Bread. A protein portion. Not a feast, not luxury, but steady calories. Enough to stop the constant hollow in the stomach. Enough to think. The corporal ate without looking up. At 6:55, the first roll call of the day began. Prisoners stood in rows. MPs walked the line with clipboards and counts. The perimeter system was simple and brutal in its logic. Fences, wire, towers, disciplined routine. Not a battlefield, but still a controlled space with lethal force on standby. At 7:18, a camp officer stepped in front of the formation. He wore a peaked cap and carried himself like administration, not combat. He spoke through an interpreter. Work details. Camp rules. Punishments for fighting. The purpose wasn't kindness. It was order. At 8:03, the corporal was assigned to a work detail inside the compound. Cleaning, maintenance, moving supplies. The Americans did not give prisoners rifles. They gave them shovels. They did not ask them to swear loyalty. They asked them to follow schedules. At 10:12, he saw the baseball field again. This time, it wasn't just American soldiers on the diamond. A group of prisoners stood near the fence, watching. Some had already traded their rigid posture for curiosity. One older man mimed the motion of pitching with his hand, remembering mechanics that belonged to a past life. At 10:20, an MP walked over and waved them closer, not across the fence, not into the American team space, but to a safer viewing line. The message was clear: watch if you want. Don't cause trouble. The corporal watched the ball's flight. Clean arc fast. The crack of impact. The runner's feet tearing at grass. He measured it like a soldier measures a battlefield. Distance from home to first, 90 feet. Speed of the throw, angle of the hit. His mind reached for familiar metrics because emotion was dangerous. At 11:05, he returned to work detail. A guard at the gate muttered a slur under his breath. The corporal heard it and stiffened. He had expected that tone. Not because of America's policy, but because war filled men with hate. He waited for the next step, an excuse, a strike, a boot. It didn't come. The guard looked away. Another MP, older, a sergeant with a lined face, caught the exchange and gave the younger guard a hard look. Discipline mattered. The U.S. Army did not remove racism from men's mouths overnight. But it did build systems that punished uncontrolled violence when it threatened control. That was the difference the prisoner could feel even if he didn't have the language for it. At 13:30, the corporal was called back to interrogation. This time the interrogator brought a map. It wasn't dramatic. No spotlights. No threats. Just paper, pencils, and a careful sequence of questions. The map was an American grid, clear and modern, with contour lines and marked villages. The interrogator tapped points with the eraser of his pencil. At 1341, he asked about the unit's last defensive positions on the island. How far back the machine guns were set, whether they used caves, whether they moved at night. He asked about mortars, and the corporal, without thinking, named the calibers the way he'd been taught: 81 millimeters, 90 millimeters. He described the weight of ammo crates and how quickly a mortar pit ran dry under sustained fire. At 1409, the interrogator asked why so many Japanese soldiers fought to the end. The corporal's answer came slowly. Not because it was secret, but because it was painful to say aloud. Surrender meant shame. Shame meant the end of a life even if the body kept breathing. The interrogator nodded as if it confirmed a file he'd read 100 times. At 1422, the interrogator shifted again. He asked what the corporal expected Americans to do after capture. The corporal repeated it: torture, execution. That fear was common. U.S. surveys and prisoner statements repeatedly showed that most Japanese captives anticipated death or brutal punishment. The fear had been manufactured and maintained. The Americans didn't need to invent it, they only needed to contradict it. At 1435, the interrogator ended the session with the same calm routine and sent the corporal back. At 1650, recreation time began. This was the part that most frightened him, not because it was violent, but because it was unfamiliar. In his world, relaxation in captivity meant deception. It meant a trap. He walked to the field with other prisoners under escort. At 1702, a crate was set down on the grass. Inside were baseballs and gloves, worn but usable. A bat with scuff marks along its barrel. The equipment wasn't given like a gift. It was issued like anything else in the camp: controlled, counted, returned. At 1708, an American sergeant stood with arms crossed and watched the prisoners handle the gear. He wasn't smiling. He was evaluating. Could this group manage a game without fighting? Could they play without using the bat as a club? Could they be trusted with a small freedom? At 1711, one prisoner stepped forward and asked, through an interpreter, if they could organize teams. The sergeant nodded once. At 1716, the first throw crossed the air. A simple toss. 20 feet. A catch. Then another. The corporal stood at the edge, hands at his sides, unsure if taking the glove meant surrendering something inside himself. At 1721, a glove was extended toward him. The leather smelled like sweat and dust. Familiar. He took it. He didn't smile. Not yet. But his fingers closed around the pocket the way they had when he was a boy. His shoulders loosened by a fraction. At 1724, he caught his first ball in an American camp. The impact was solid, harmless, real. Not a blow. Not a punishment. A baseball. And in that moment, he understood what the Americans were really doing. They weren't only guarding prisoners. They were rewriting the story those prisoners had been trained to believe. They were turning survival into proof. Proof that surrender did not always mean humiliation and death. Proof that the Emperor's war story had lied. At 1936, on October 4, 1944, the corporal returned the glove to the crate exactly as ordered. He lined up with the others. He walked back through the compound under the same floodlights and the same towers. Nothing about the wire had changed. The only shift was inside his own head. The enemy he had been taught to imagine did not match the men holding rifles on the perimeter. At 20:05, he lay down and slept for the first time since capture without rehearsing his own execution. At 6:02 on October 5, the camp schedule hit again: roll call, chow, work detail. In a war that ran on logistics, the camp was another machine. Barrack space measured in bunks, food measured in pounds per day, staffing measured in man-hours. Guards rotated shifts. Watch schedules were posted. Rifles were inspected. Ammunition counts were logged. The prisoners were not guests. They were still enemies. But they were handled as controlled assets, not targets. At 8:40, The corporal was escorted to interrogation for the third time. The interrogator did not change his approach. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't promise freedom. He did something more practical. He built routine. Routine made the prisoner predictable. Routine made him talk. At 8:47, the interrogator laid out a stack of documents, translations of captured orders, unit rosters, and maps recovered from dead Japanese officers. The corporal recognized the format immediately. The paper quality, the stamp marks, the phrasing of orders. It felt like looking at his own side through a broken mirror. At 8:53, the interrogator asked him to confirm names, then dates, then locations. At 9:06, the corporal corrected a minor detail without thinking, an officer's surname, a battalion number, the location of a supply dump. It was a reflex. The interrogator wrote it down, calm and fast. This was how the Americans extracted intelligence. Not by beating prisoners until they said anything to stop the pain, but by using consistency, verification, and time. They compared statements across multiple captives. They checked answers against captured paperwork. They tested information with small questions and watched for contradictions. At 9:22, the interrogator asked about morale. How many men in the corporal's unit still believed the war could be won after the island campaign collapsed? The corporal hesitated. This wasn't a map coordinate. It was the truth of what he had seen. Officers making promises they couldn't keep, soldiers digging positions they knew would be overrun, men dying in caves because surrender was forbidden. At 9:31, he answered anyway. He said morale was breaking long before the final assaults. At 9:44, the interrogator paused, then asked a question that seemed simple but wasn't. Before you were captured, he said, what did you think Americans would do to you? The corporal repeated it again, torture and death. He was not alone. The interrogator had seen the statistics in reports. In compiled prisoner statements, the overwhelming majority, figures like 84%, expected torture and execution after capture. It was fear written into training and reinforced by propaganda. If the enemy was a monster, surrender was pointless. At 10:03, the interrogator pushed a different point across the table. A camp bulletin in Japanese describing recreation schedules, medical visits, and work assignments. It was plain language. It wasn't sentimental. It read like administration. It was, in its own way, a weapon. At 10:19, the session ended. No threats. No shouting. The corporal was escorted back. At 12 o'clock, he ate lunch, and he noticed something else that would have been unthinkable in his old unit. Food arrived on time. Portions were consistent. No officer cut the line. No one stole from the weak because the system was structured to prevent it. At 13:15, he walked past the camp canteen and saw prisoners buying small items, soap, paper, tobacco, with a stipend credited to them. It wasn't generosity. It was policy. Pay reduced tension. Pay reinforced the idea of a predictable system. Predictable systems were easier to control than desperate men. By 16:30, the corporal had started watching other prisoners more closely than the guards. Some prisoners stayed rigid for weeks, speaking little, eyes always scanning for betrayal. Others shifted faster. The ones who had been junior enlisted, men with less ideological investment and fewer secrets, often adjusted first. The older NCOs and officers adjusted slower, clinging to doctrine like armor. At 18:20, that evening, the corporal heard a commotion near the administrative building. A camp announcement. Once a week, groups of prisoners would be taken to a local theater for a controlled film showing. Lights up, guards posted, seating assigned, head counts taken at entry and exit. It sounded impossible. The corporal watched faces around him tighten with suspicion, then loosen with curiosity. At 19:02, an older prisoner spoke under his breath, almost angry, "They want us to forget." The corporal didn't answer. He didn't think the Americans wanted them to forget. He thought the Americans wanted them to see. At 9:10 on October 9th, a prisoner group moved out for the theater detail. The procedure was exact. MPs carried rifles and sidearms. Prisoners marched in formation. The route was pre-planned. Vehicles were positioned at intervals. Head counts were taken before departure, at arrival, and again before return. The prisoners were not free, and the guards were not careless. At 9:58, the corporal stepped into a civilian building for the first time in years. The smell hit him first: popcorn, floor cleaner, perfume. He saw American families at a distance, held back by rope lines and supervision, watching the prisoners as if they were a traveling exhibit. He expected insults. He expected thrown objects. Some people stared. Some looked away. A few muttered words he didn't understand but could hear the tone. But nothing erupted. The MPs watched the crowd as much as they watched the prisoners. At 10:17, the film began. The corporal didn't know the title. The plot didn't matter. What mattered was the fact of it. The enemy had put him in a seat instead of a cell and expected him to behave like a human being in public. At 12:46, back at camp, he returned to work detail. And slowly, without noticing the exact moment it happened, he began to speak more during interrogation sessions. Not everything, not suddenly, but enough for the interrogator to keep building a clearer picture. This was the pivot U.S. intelligence units aimed for. Not sympathy. Not friendship. Cooperation. The American approach to Japanese POWs had two layers running at the same time. One was legal and administrative, camp standards, medical care, controlled labor, recreation, routine, the outward shape of Geneva compliance. The other layer was tactical: extract intelligence, understand doctrine, learn how units moved, what weapons they used, how they resisted, and where their breaking points were. At 14:12 on October 12th, the interrogator showed the corporal a set of leaflets, Japanese language messages the Americans dropped on frontline positions. Some showed photographs of captured Japanese soldiers eating and receiving medical care. Some described humane treatment and urged surrender. The corporal recognized the style. He had seen similar leaflets in the field and dismissed them as lies. Now he held them in his hands and realized why they were effective. Not because every Japanese soldier would believe them, but because the men who did surrender would become living evidence. At 15:08, the interrogator asked the corporal if he would be willing to record a short message to be used in broadcasts or leaflets, something simple, confirming survival and humane treatment. The corporal froze. This was the line. In his old world, speaking for the enemy was betrayal. At 15:14, the interrogator didn't press. He simply noted the hesitation and moved on to military questions. He understood timing. Trust could be accelerated, but it couldn't be forced without breaking it. At 17:33, after that session, the corporal walked back to the barracks and stared at the baseball field. He didn't see sport anymore. He saw a method. The Americans were showing prisoners baseball instead of beatings for the same reason they issued canteen stipends and organized film showings. It wasn't softness. It was control. It was psychological warfare aimed at a specific weak point in Japanese doctrine, the belief that surrender was a dead end. In the weeks that followed, some prisoners crossed a threshold the corporal still couldn't imagine. A few would later describe the shift in blunt, almost religious language. Men saying they had died as Japanese soldiers at capture and had to rebuild their loyalty around a new reality. The corporal wasn't there yet. But by 21:10 on October 12th, lying under the barracks lights, he admitted one thing in the privacy of his own mind. If the enemy was not the monster he had been promised, then everything he had been ordered to believe, about surrender, about honor, about how wars ended, had to be questioned. And that questioning was exactly what the camp was designed to produce. At 6:18 on November 2nd, 1944, the first snow dusted the wire at Camp McCoy. The towers looked sharper against the white. The corporal stood in formation with his collar turned up, breath visible in short bursts. He watched the MP's hands on their rifles, fingers outside trigger guards, muzzles down, posture disciplined. He had started to read the guards the way he used to read his own platoon. Tired men cut corners. Angry men lingered near trouble. Professional men did their job and went home. At 7:04, the corporal's name, his number, was called for interrogation again. He walked to the same office. Same table. Same overhead bulb. Same American who spoke Japanese with that flat accent. The interrogator had been tracking him for weeks, not as a person to be saved, but as a source to be developed. At 7:10, the interrogator placed a new folder down. A typed summary. A list of questions. A small photograph clipped to the corner. A Japanese POW baseball team posed in uniform, gloves in hand. The corporal stared at it longer than he should have. At 7:14, the interrogator spoke plainly. "You understand why we treat you this way," he said. "It keeps order. It makes you talk. It tells your soldiers outside that surrender is possible." The bluntness hit harder than any threat. There was no pretense of sentiment. The camp's calm was not charity. It was a strategy. At 7:18, the interrogator pushed the next question across the table. Would the corporal give a message to other Japanese soldiers still fighting? The corporal's throat tightened. The request wasn't new. But time had changed the ground under his feet. In his old unit, the chain of loyalty was rigid. Emperor, officer, unit, death. In captivity, the chain had broken. Not because he had stopped caring about Japan, but because the context that enforced those beliefs, fear, hierarchy, immediate violence, was gone. Here, the most immediate power was the camp routine. And routine, day after day, did something he hadn't been trained to defend against. It normalized survival. At 7:21, he asked a question back, careful and quiet. "If I speak, what happens to me?" The interrogator answered without pause. "You stay a prisoner until the war ends. You get food. You get medical care. You get treated according to policy. Nothing more. No promises. No freedom. No illusions." At 7:24, the corporal nodded once. And then he agreed. The message, recorded later, was short and controlled. No dramatic pleas, no denunciations, no propaganda slogans. Just confirmation. Captured soldiers were alive. Treatment was not what the Japanese army had claimed. Surrender did not automatically mean torture or execution. The power was in its simplicity. At 8:02, the corporal left the office and felt something settle in his chest. Not relief. Not pride. A heavy, final awareness. He had crossed a line that made return to his old world impossible. That was the true cost of capture in Japanese doctrine, not the enemy's fists, but the social death that followed. At 11:30, he was back on work detail, stacking crates in a storage shed. The crates were marked in English with weights and inventory numbers. Everything was counted. Everything was tracked. The corporal had spent months in the Pacific watching supply collapse into improvisation, ammo rationed, food stolen, medicine non-existent. Here, even the camp's monotony was supported by industrial capacity. In the broader war, that capacity was what was crushing Japan. By late 1944, the United States was moving divisions across oceans with a rhythm Japan could not match. Liberty ships delivered tonnage. Fleet oilers kept carriers at sea. Repair ships patched damage fast. The same logistical system that fed Marines on Iwo Jima and soldiers in Europe also fed enemy prisoners in Wisconsin. The corporal understood the implication. This was a war of systems, and Japan's system was failing. At 14:10, recreation began again. The baseball field had become a routine marker of time. Games formed informal hierarchies among prisoners, who pitched, who caught, who organized teams, who argued calls. It wasn't just sport, it was a rehearsal of civilian life under controlled conditions. The camp allowed it because it reduced tension. The prisoners embraced it because it restored fragments of identity that war had stripped away. At 15:22, the corporal stepped to the plate. He gripped the bat, heavier than the makeshift sticks of childhood, balanced for real hits. The pitcher's motion was clean. The ball came in fast. He swung. Contact. A sharp crack. For a half-second, the sound snapped him back to another kind of crack, rifle fire in jungle heat. But this impact carried no death. The ball rose, arcing into open field. Men shouted. Boots pounded grass. The corporal ran toward first base, legs pumping, lungs burning, and for the length of that sprint he was not a soldier or a prisoner. He was only a body moving for a purpose that didn't involve killing. He reached the bag at 15:23, safe. At 17:40, as the sun dropped, the MP sergeant supervising the field counted equipment back into the crate. Gloves returned. Balls returned. Bat returned. Order restored. Nothing about the wire changed. But the camp's psychological effect did not stop at the fence. The recordings and prisoner statements, carefully selected, carefully framed, were fed into a wider Allied information campaign. Leaflets dropped on front lines. Broadcasts aimed at isolated garrisons. Messages designed to undermine the belief that capture was worse than death. Not every soldier believed it. Many still fought to the end. But even small shifts mattered. Every man who surrendered was one less rifle firing, one less body in a cave forcing an assault. In intelligence terms, every cooperative prisoner was also a source. At 9:50 on February 20th, 1945, the corporal was called to a larger briefing room. A new officer was present, higher rank, sharper uniform, the posture of someone who managed programs rather than interviews. He spoke through the usual translator and explained a new assignment. The corporal would help with training materials for other interrogators, explaining Japanese unit structure, terminology, and common evasions. It wasn't glamorous. It was clerical and controlled. But it was work that mattered. The corporal listened, expression blank, while his mind raced. He had gone from expecting torture to being asked to teach the enemy how to question his own side more effectively. That was the full arc of the American method. Keep him alive, build routine, extract details, then turn those details into leverage. At 13:05, he began the work. He drew diagrams of squad organization. He explained ranks and honorifics. He described how officers issued orders, how men spoke in formal language, how shame and obedience shaped answers. He warned interrogators which questions triggered rehearsed lies and which ones pulled genuine details. He pointed out how soldiers might hide a unit's true strength by understating numbers or exaggerating shortages. He did it with a calm that surprised him. By then, he had come to a conclusion that was as practical as it was painful. The war would end, and he would survive it. Survival required adapting to the reality in front of him, not the doctrine behind him. At 7:46 on August 15, 1945, the camp loudspeakers carried news across the compound. Japan had announced surrender. Some prisoners collapsed onto bunks, shaking. Some cried. Some stared at the ground in silence. A few shouted in anger. The corporal sat still and listened to the translation. The words felt unreal. 4 years, surrender had been presented as impossible. Now it was official. At 10:30, MPs increased watch rotations. The camp understood what this news could trigger: violence, suicide attempts, fights between prisoners who blamed each other. Procedures tightened. Medical staff stood by. Chaplains were alerted. The system adapted. At 1400 hours, the corporal walked to the baseball field and stood near the fence alone. The diamond was empty. The grass was worn in patches where cleats had dug in. The backstop cast a long shadow. He thought about the first day he heard the bat crack. The shock of kindness where he expected cruelty. He understood now why it had worked. It hadn't erased fear immediately. It had planted doubt. And doubt, in a mind trained for absolute obedience, was destabilizing. In the months after the surrender, repatriation began in phases: paperwork, medical checks, transport schedules. Some prisoners would return to Japan and try to rebuild lives in a country shattered by bombings and defeat. Others would carry the stigma of captivity for years. Some, influenced by their experience, would become voices, quiet or loud, about how wartime doctrine had lied to them. The corporal did not know what his own future would be. But he knew what the camp had changed. It had proven that treatment could be used as a weapon without leaving bruises. It had shown that discipline could replace cruelty. And it had turned something as ordinary as baseball into a tool that struck at the heart of an enemy's belief system. Years later, in war museums and history books, the images would look almost absurd: enemy prisoners in uniforms, gloves on their hands, standing on an American field under guard. But to the men who lived it, the meaning was precise. They had expected beatings. The Americans had shown them baseball instead.